Well, we're halfway through the show, which means it's time for Kendrick Lamar to come out and call Drake a pedophile. Don't worry, I'm lawyered up. Anyway.
Before the conflict had a name, before headlines and diss tracks and timelines hardened into sides, there was a landscape already under pressure. Hip-hop in the early 21st century had expanded into an empire. Its borders were no longer local. Its language traveled faster than geography. Its heroes were no longer bound to cities alone, but to screens, charts, and algorithms. Visibility had become power, and power had become measurable. Streams, numbers, reach. The arena was no longer just the stage or the street corner. It was global, illuminated by constant light. In that environment, two forces were rising along different paths, moving toward the center without yet seeing each other clearly. One emerged as a figure of fluid adaptation, shaped by access to the spotlight and fluent in its grammar. The other formed in resistance to that same light, suspicious of its warmth, wary of what it asked in return. Neither announced a rivalry. None was required. The conditions themselves were already arranging the collision. Drake entered the era as a voice that traveled easily. His music crossed borders with little friction, slipping between genres, moods, and audiences. He was visible everywhere at once, a presence that could occupy radio waves, club spaces, and private headphones without altering his shape. His ascent felt continuous rather than explosive, an expansion rather than a rupture. Each success reinforced the next, like an empire extending its roads outward from a fortified center. Kendrick Lamar arrived differently. His presence was quieter at first, heavier in density, slower to translate. His work carried the gravity of place, of memory, of internal pressure that resisted simplification. He did not move toward the center by ease of access, but by insistence. His music demanded attention rather than courting it. Where one voice flowed, the other condensed. Where one reflected the surface of the moment, the other pulled downward. At the time, the culture did not frame this as opposition. The narrative of abundance allowed both trajectories to coexist. Hip-hop was large enough to hold contradictions, or so it seemed. One could dominate the charts, while the other reshaped critical language. One could become omnipresent, while the other became symbolic. The empire was still expanding, and expansion tends to delay conflict by promising room for everyone. Yet beneath that promise, pressure accumulated. Power concentrates even when it appears diffuse. Visibility reshapes desire. As media environments intensified, they rewarded repetition and punished absence. To be seen was to matter. To withdraw was to risk irrelevance. This logic did not announce itself as coercion. It arrived as opportunity, as affirmation, as applause that never fully stopped. Drake learned to live inside that applause. His music mirrored the conditions of its circulation, adaptable, emotionally legible, immediately recognizable. He became not just an artist, but a structure, a reference point through which success itself could be imagined. His presence set the temperature of the room. Others adjusted accordingly, whether they intended to or not. Kendrick responded by narrowing rather than widening. As the spotlight grew harsher, he stepped into shadow, not as retreat, but as strategy. His work absorbed contradiction, guilt, ambition, and moral tension without offering easy release. He refused the smoothness that visibility rewards. In doing so, he positioned himself not as a competitor for attention, but as a counterweight to it. The culture did not yet name this as rivalry, but the symmetry was already forming. Every cultural moment produces its own myths. In this one, the myth was choice. Audiences were told they could have everything, depth and dominance, introspection, and ubiquity. The system encouraged this belief because it sustained consumption without demanding alignment. But myths crack under repetition. Eventually, symbols begin to overlap. Roles blur. Questions surface that cannot be postponed. Who speaks for the era? Who defines its values? Who stands at the center, and by what right? These questions do not emerge from personal animosity. They emerge from structure, from the way attention organizes itself around figures who seem to embody something larger than themselves. Drake and Kendrick did not invent these questions. They inherited them. They were shaped by an industry that had learned to monetize authenticity and a media environment that transformed every gesture into signal. Each artist became a vessel for competing answers. One suggested that mastery meant total visibility, that survival required adaptation without fracture. The other implied that mastery demanded resistance, that clarity came from narrowing focus even at the cost of reach. The tension remained latent because neither path directly challenged the other at first. Success insulated both. As long as the empire expanded, the foundations did not need to be examined. But expansion slows. Saturation follows. The spotlight grows crowded. At that point, presence itself becomes a provocation. Silence, too. When Kendrick withdrew between projects, the absence was not empty. It accumulated meaning. It cast a shadow that grew longer as the light intensified elsewhere. Meanwhile, Drake's omnipresence began to harden into expectation. The empire required constant motion. The crown demanded maintenance. This is how conflicts begin before they are spoken. Not with insults, but with incompatible answers to the same historical pressure. Not with direct confrontation, but with mirrored ascent toward the same symbolic center. The stage was already built. The audience was already divided by temperament, by desire, by what they wanted music to do for them. By the time the first clear shots were fired, the outcome no longer belonged solely to the artists. The rivalry had been authored by years of accumulation, by an industry that thrived on spectacle, and by a culture hungry for meaning in figures large enough to carry it. What followed would not simply be a feud. It would be a test of values, of identity, of what hip-hop had become, and what it could no longer avoid confronting. The conflict had not yet announced itself, but the ground was already trembling. Drake and Kendrick Lamar emerged from different social geometries, shaped by distinct pressures long before they became symbolic rivals. Their divergence is not simply aesthetic. It is structural, psychological, and historical, rooted in how each learned to occupy space, claim legitimacy, and relate to power. To understand the rivalry, one must understand the worlds that produced them and the strategies those worlds made necessary. Drake's formation occurs at a crossroads of visibility and exclusion. Raised in Toronto, outside the traditional American centers of hip-hop, he enters the culture already marked as peripheral. His background does not grant him automatic access to the mythology of the genre. Instead, it places him in a liminal position, close enough to see the throne, far enough to feel its distance. This early condition cultivates a heightened sensitivity to recognition. Belonging is never assumed. It must be earned, negotiated, reinforced. That sensitivity becomes a driving force. Drake's artistic persona develops around emotional legibility, confession, and adaptability. He learns to translate vulnerability into currency, intimacy into scale. His voice carries longing not only for romantic validation, but for cultural acceptance. The desire to be seen, to be acknowledged as legitimate, operates beneath the surface of his success. Each triumph answers a question that was once unresolved. The industry rewards this orientation. As hip-hop expands into a global commodity, artists who can move fluidly between identities gain advantage. Drake becomes fluent in that movement. He does not anchor himself to a single territory or moral position. Instead, he reflects the desires of the moment, absorbing regional sounds, emotional tones, and stylistic cues. This is not mimicry so much as strategic alignment. He becomes a mirror polished by repetition. Kendrick Lamar's origins impose a different set of demands. Raised in Compton, a city whose symbolic weight in hip-hop history is inseparable from violence, survival, and narrative authenticity, Kendrick inherits a heavy archive. His legitimacy is not questioned in the same way Drake's is. Instead, it arrives with expectations. He is assumed to represent something larger than himself, to carry the voice of place, trauma, and continuity. This inheritance shapes his psychology. Kendrick's work is marked by internal tension rather than outward flexibility. He does not seek to dissolve boundaries. He interrogates them. His music returns obsessively to themes of guilt, responsibility, and moral fracture. Where Drake externalizes desire, Kendrick internalizes conflict. His artistic development is less about access and more about burden. The contrast becomes clearer when placed against the shifting landscape of the industry. By the late 2000s, hip-hop is no longer governed solely by regional gatekeepers. Digital platforms weaken old barriers while introducing new forms of control. Visibility becomes algorithmic. Success becomes quantifiable. This environment favors those who can sustain constant presence. It punishes absence, ambiguity, and delay. Drake thrives under these conditions. His output aligns with the logic of the system. Frequent releases, strategic collaborations, and emotional immediacy keep him in circulation. He becomes synonymous with the era's pace. His persona adapts without breaking, allowing him to occupy multiple emotional registers while maintaining coherence. The crown fits because it is adjustable. Kendrick moves against that current. His releases are infrequent, dense, and conceptually demanding. Each project arrives as an event rather than a stream. This resistance to constant visibility enhances his symbolic weight. Absence becomes part of his presence. Silence becomes pressure. He is not always seen, but he is always anticipated. This dynamic positions him as a figure of judgment rather than participation. Psychologically, this difference maps onto deeper patterns. Drake's orientation reflects a pursuit of the ideal image, a constant negotiation between self and audience. His persona is shaped by projection and response. He watches himself being watched. Success becomes a feedback loop that requires maintenance. The fear is not failure but erasure, the loss of relevance that follows withdrawal. Kendrick's orientation reflects confrontation with the shadow. His work refuses easy identification. It exposes contradictions rather than smoothing them over. He does not offer himself as an object of uncomplicated admiration. Instead, he stages conflict within the self, forcing listeners to confront discomfort. Authority in this model comes not from dominance but from moral gravity. These psychological trajectories intersect with broader cultural narratives. Drake embodies a vision of success aligned with late capitalist ideals, expansion, accessibility, emotional transparency packaged for scale. Kendrick embodies a counter-narrative, one that insists on limits, on the cost of visibility, on the responsibility attached to voice. Neither position is neutral. Both carry ideological weight. As their careers progress, these differences become increasingly visible. Drake's dominance of charts and platforms positions him as the default representative of the era. His voice saturates public space. For many listeners, he becomes the sound of their emotional lives, present at moments of celebration, loss, and routine. This ubiquity grants power, but it also invites scrutiny. Kendrick's influence operates differently. He shapes not habits, but hierarchies of value. His work becomes a reference point for seriousness, for artistic integrity, for what the genre can achieve beyond consumption. Younger artists look to him not for templates to replicate, but for permission to explore complexity. His authority is symbolic rather than statistical. The industry amplifies this contrast. Media narratives frame Drake as the measure of success and Kendrick as the measure of meaning. These frames simplify, but they persist because they resonate with underlying tensions in the culture. Hip-hop is asked to be both product and protest, entertainment and testimony. Drake and Kendrick come to personify these competing demands. The rivalry does not begin with hostility. It begins with proximity. Collaboration places them briefly on the same stage, highlighting the difference rather than resolving it. One moves with ease through the spotlight. The other stands slightly apart, absorbing its heat without yielding to it. The imbalance is subtle, but it is felt. Recognition becomes the fault line. Drake seeks acknowledgement from the culture that once questioned his belonging. Kendrick seeks acknowledgement that his moral authority outweighs numerical dominance. Each desires validation, but the terms differ. One wants acceptance. The other wants confirmation of leadership. These desires are not mutually exclusive, but the system treats them as such. The more Drake occupies space, the more Kendrick's restraint reads as critique. The more Kendrick's work is elevated as art, the more Drake's accessibility is framed as compromise. The culture begins to organize itself around this opposition, even before either artist names it. At this stage, the rivalry remains implicit. It lives in interviews, in lyrical subtext, in the way audiences compare without consensus. The tension is not yet violent. It is gravitational. Two bodies exerting force on the same symbolic center, each altering the field around them. The foundations are set. Social origin, psychological orientation, industry structure, and cultural expectation converge. What follows is not a personal feud, but an inevitable escalation of meaning. When words are finally sharpened into weapons, they will draw power from everything that came before. The arena is ready. The first movement is about to begin. The rivalry begins not with confrontation, but with alignment. Drake and Kendrick Lamar occupy the same stage before they oppose each other, and that proximity is essential. History rarely produces meaningful conflict between strangers. Rivalry requires recognition. It requires the sense that the other matters, that their position overlaps with yours in a way that cannot be ignored. When Drake invites Kendrick onto his tour, the gesture appears generous, even strategic. At the time, it reads as coexistence within abundance. In retrospect, it marks the first visible fault line. On the surface, the tour represents harmony within the new order of hip-hop. Drake stands as the emerging center, buoyed by commercial success and cultural omnipresence. Kendrick appears as the ascendant conscience, sharp, focused, still proving his reach. Their collaboration suggests continuity, a passing of energy rather than a struggle for space. But shared stages amplify contrast. Audiences do not simply consume performances. They compare them. Difference becomes legible in real time. Drake's presence is expansive. His performance style emphasizes connection, familiarity, emotional availability. He speaks to the crowd as participants in a shared experience. Kendrick's presence is more contained, almost austere. His delivery is intense, deliberate, resistant to dilution. He does not invite the crowd in so much as confront them. The contrast is not hostile, but it is unmistakable. Two philosophies of power occupy the same arena. The moment that crystallizes this tension arrives not as an insult, but as a declaration. Kendrick's verse on control functions less as a diss than as a line drawn across the field. He names his peers, not to belittle them, but to position himself against them. The verse asserts hierarchy. It reframes competition as responsibility. To be named is to be challenged. To be excluded would have been an insult. Inclusion makes the challenge unavoidable. Drake's reaction exposes the underlying psychological stakes. The verse threatens not his dominance, but his narrative. Drake's position rests on consensus, on broad acceptance, on the idea that success itself confers legitimacy. Kendrick's declaration implies an alternative order, one where legitimacy is not granted by scale but by confrontation, by the willingness to stand alone and claim authority. The challenge is symbolic before it is personal. Media amplification transforms this symbolic moment into spectacle. Interviews dissect reactions. Silence is interpreted as weakness. Response becomes mandatory. The culture begins to ask who will speak and how. In this environment, restraint is not neutral. It is red. Drake's hesitation, his measured responses, signal discomfort with the frame Kendrick has imposed. He is being asked to compete on terrain that does not reward his strengths. The first movement of the rivalry is defined by asymmetry. Kendrick strikes by narrowing focus. Drake deflects by expanding context. Kendrick positions himself as judge. Drake positions himself as participant in a larger ecosystem. Neither strategy is accidental. Each reflects a deeper orientation toward power. One seeks to redefine the center. The other seeks to absorb the challenge without ceding ground. Culturally, this moment resonates because it surfaces anxieties already present in the audience. Hip-hop fans have grown accustomed to equating dominance with numbers. Kendrick's intervention questions that equation. It suggests that influence operates differently, that leadership cannot be reduced to metrics. This destabilizes existing hierarchies, creating discomfort that demands resolution. The rivalry remains largely rhetorical at this stage. There are no direct attacks, no explicit diss tracks exchanged. But the field has shifted. Every subsequent move is interpreted through this lens. Collaboration becomes suspect. Praise sounds strategic. Silence sounds loaded. The culture begins to map meaning onto absence as much as presence. This movement establishes the stakes. It is not about who is better in a technical sense. It is about who defines value, who sets the terms by which greatness is measured. Drake's empire depends on continuity, on the smooth functioning of the system that elevated him. Kendrick's challenge introduces friction into that system, questioning whether it deserves to stand unexamined. The first movement ends without resolution. The tension does not explode. It settles. It embeds itself into discourse, into expectation, into the way each artist is discussed even when the other is not present. The rivalry has not yet become violent, but it has become structural. From this point forward, nothing either artist does exists in isolation. The arena has been marked. The audience has been alerted. The conflict has acquired momentum. The second movement will transform implication into escalation. If the first movement establishes the rivalry as symbolic, the second transforms it into pressure. What was once implication begins to harden into pattern. The culture no longer waits for explicit confrontation. It starts producing it. Every release, every interview, every absence is filtered through the question that Kendrick's declaration left behind. Who holds the center now? Drake responds by consolidating territory. His output increases in scale and confidence. Projects arrive with regularity. Collaborations stretch across regions and generations. He does not retreat from the spotlight. He intensifies it. The strategy is familiar to empires under scrutiny. When authority is questioned, visibility becomes reassurance. Presence itself becomes proof of legitimacy. This period marks Drake's full transformation from artist to institution. His voice is no longer just a sound, but an infrastructure, woven into playlists, radio rotations, social rituals. His music adapts to mood rather than imposing one. It becomes flexible enough to accompany almost any moment. This omnipresence reinforces his position, but it also exposes him to a new vulnerability. When an artist becomes environment, critique begins to feel like resistance rather than disagreement. Kendrick moves in the opposite direction. His work during this phase becomes increasingly inward and confrontational. Albums arrive not as collections of songs, but as cohesive moral statements. He interrogates fame, violence, hypocrisy, and complicity with a precision that leaves little room for escape. He does not address Drake directly. He does not need to. The critique is systemic. Drake's figure simply occupies the most visible position within that system. The contrast sharpens. Drake's music emphasizes relatability and emotional immediacy. Kendrick's emphasizes responsibility and consequence. Drake offers catharsis through identification. Kendrick offers unease through reflection. The culture begins to split along these lines, not neatly but perceptibly. Audiences align not just with artists, but with what those artists represent. Media narratives amplify the divide. Drake is framed as the king, the undisputed ruler of numbers and reach. Kendrick is framed as the conscience, the artist's artist, the moral counterweight. These labels simplify, but they stick because they resonate. The rivalry is no longer about individual tracks. It is about competing visions of leadership. Psychologically, the dynamic resembles a mirror held too close. Kendrick's work exposes questions Drake's persona cannot fully absorb without fracture. Authenticity, depth, responsibility. Drake's success rests on being everything to everyone, a position that resists singular moral stance. Kendrick's critique implies that such fluidity comes at a cost. The cost is coherence. Drake responds defensively, not with retreat, but with assertion. His lyrics increasingly emphasize dominance, longevity, resilience against criticism. He frames dissent as envy, critique as bitterness. This rhetorical move shifts the frame from values to motives. If critics are jealous, their arguments can be dismissed without engagement. This strategy protects the crown but narrows the conversation. Kendrick's silence during this phase grows louder. Each gap between releases becomes charged. Absence reads as preparation. When he returns, it is not to clarify but to complicate. His projects refuse easy moral binaries. He implicates himself as much as others. This refusal to occupy a clean position strengthens his authority. He is not preaching from outside the system. He is indicting it from within. Culturally, this movement coincides with broader shifts. Social media accelerates discourse, rewards outrage, flattens nuance. Hip-hop debates become spectacles, reduced to takes and counters. In this environment, Drake's accessibility thrives. Kendrick's density resists compression. This resistance itself becomes symbolic. To engage Kendrick fully requires time, attention, patience. To engage Drake requires recognition. The rivalry now functions as a lens through which the genre examines itself. Is hip-hop a mirror for emotional life or a tool for moral reckoning? Is success defined by reach or by depth? These questions are not resolved because they cannot be. They reflect a culture split between consumption and critique, between comfort and confrontation. As the second movement progresses, the tension becomes personal without becoming explicit. Lyrics are parsed for subtext. Interviews are mined for slights. Fans become interpreters, projecting intention where none is stated. This projection fuels the rivalry, sustaining it even in the absence of direct conflict. Each side sees confirmation of their position everywhere. The psychological stakes intensify. Drake's need for recognition now collides with Kendrick's claim to authority. One seeks affirmation through numbers, the other through moral weight. Neither can fully concede without undermining their core identity. The rivalry becomes less about winning than about maintaining coherence under pressure. By the end of this movement, the conflict has matured. It no longer requires provocation to persist. It is embedded in perception. The artists may not speak, but the culture speaks for them. The arena hums with anticipation, waiting not for another implication but for collision. The third movement will bring that collision into focus, transforming sustained tension into open confrontation and irreversible consequence. The third movement begins when restraint collapses under accumulated weight. What had been sustained through implication and silence now demands articulation. The rivalry crosses a threshold where subtext is no longer sufficient, where the pressure of years compresses into direct language. At this stage, confrontation is no longer a choice. It is an event produced by saturation. Kendrick's return arrives with a sharpened edge. His voice is no longer merely interrogative. It is accusatory, precise, unflinching. The critique narrows its focus, drawing the abstract into the personal without losing its systemic force. Drake is no longer an unnamed symbol of excess or compromise. He becomes a figure through which the contradictions of the era can be addressed directly. The shadow takes shape. Drake responds from a position of visibility that has hardened into vulnerability. His dominance of space means there is nowhere to retreat. Every word is amplified, every gesture magnified. The defensive posture that once deflected critique now feels reactive. He answers accusation with assertion, authority with insistence. The language of supremacy returns, but its resonance has shifted. What once sounded confident now risks sounding strained. The exchange unfolds not as a clean duel, but as a cascade. Tracks appear in rapid succession, each escalating the tone, narrowing the distance between symbol and insult. The rivalry sheds its ambiguity. It becomes legible even to those outside the culture. Media coverage intensifies. Timelines flood with interpretation. The conflict becomes a spectacle not because it is shallow, but because it touches something foundational. Psychologically, the confrontation exposes mirrored wounds. Kendrick's accusations center on legitimacy, on the cost of occupying space without accountability. Drake's responses center on survival, on the right to remain where he has fought to stand. Each attacks the other's core claim. Kendrick challenges Drake's moral authority. Drake challenges Kendrick's relevance beyond critique. The language employed is revealing. Kendrick's words carry the weight of judgment, invoking lineage, responsibility, and consequence. His delivery suggests inevitability, as if the verdict has been forming long before it is spoken. Drake's words emphasize endurance, framing himself as unmovable, insulated by time and success. He invokes longevity as proof, history as shield. Culturally, the confrontation fractures the audience. Alignment hardens into camps. Listeners do not simply prefer one artist over the other. They defend worldviews. One side hears Kendrick as necessary correction, a force restoring balance to a culture distorted by metrics. The other hears Drake as embodiment of adaptability, proof that survival within the system is itself a form of mastery. The rivalry now functions as ritual. Each release is anticipated not for its musical content alone, but for its symbolic implications. Fans dissect bars like evidence. Critics frame narratives of victory and defeat. The media amplifies conflict because conflict sustains attention. The arena expands beyond music into discourse itself. Yet beneath the noise, something quieter unfolds. The confrontation reveals the limits of both positions. Kendrick's moral authority risks ossification if it becomes only negation. Drake's dominance risks hollowness if it cannot absorb critique without deflection. The rivalry exposes these risks without resolving them. It is not designed to produce synthesis. As the exchange peaks, exhaustion sets in, not resolution but saturation. The culture has consumed the conflict to its edges. Every angle has been argued. Every line has been annotated. The confrontation does not end because one side yields. It ends because the system can no longer escalate without collapse. What remains is residue. The rivalry has altered perception. Drake's omnipresence now carries a question mark that cannot be erased. Kendrick's authority now carries expectation that cannot be indefinitely postponed. Both are changed by the encounter, not in their output alone, but in how that output is received. The third movement closes not with victory, but with consequence. The symbolic center has been shaken. The crown remains visible, but its meaning has shifted. The shadow has been named, but it has not been banished. What follows is not aftermath in the personal sense, but reverberation. The rivalry has escaped the control of its authors. It now belongs to the culture that projected itself onto it. The impact is about to be measured. Once the rivalry crosses into open confrontation, it no longer belongs to Drake or Kendrick Lamar as individuals. It becomes a cultural instrument, a mechanism through which the genre interrogates itself. The conflict begins to operate independently of intent, driven by collective projection, media amplification, and historical tension that had long exceeded the scale of any single artist. At this stage, the rivalry stops being about what is said and starts being about what is revealed. Hip-hop has always processed conflict publicly. Battles, beefs, and competitive posturing are not deviations from the culture, but expressions of its internal logic. Yet this rivalry differs from its predecessors because of the environment in which it unfolds. The audience is no longer localized. The stage is not confined to radio or records. It exists across platforms that reward immediacy, outrage, and alignment. The conflict becomes omnipresent, unfolding in real time across timelines, comment sections, and reaction cycles. This environment transforms rivalry into tribal identification. Listeners are compelled to choose sides, not simply as fans, but as participants in a symbolic struggle. Aligning with Drake or Kendrick becomes a way of articulating values. Comfort versus confrontation. Adaptability versus accountability. Expansion versus restraint. These alignments are rarely conscious, but they are deeply felt. The artists become avatars through which personal and collective anxieties are expressed. Drake's position attracts those who see success as survival. His dominance affirms the belief that navigating the system effectively is itself a form of intelligence. For many, his music accompanies daily life in ways that feel intimate and validating. To defend Drake is to defend the legitimacy of pleasure, accessibility, and emotional immediacy in a world that often demands justification for joy. His supporters hear critiques of him as elitist or exclusionary, dismissive of lived experience. Kendrick's position attracts those who experience that same system as corrosive. His work articulates a suspicion that ease comes at a cost, that comfort can function as anesthesia. To align with Kendrick is to affirm the value of discomfort, reflection, and moral tension. His supporters hear defenses of Drake as capitulation, as evidence that hip-hop has been reduced to content rather than expression. For them, Kendrick represents a refusal to let the genre dissolve into background noise. The rivalry intensifies these identifications by framing them as mutually exclusive. Nuance collapses under pressure. Listeners are encouraged to treat complexity as indecision. The media reinforces this collapse because binary narratives travel faster. Headlines declare winners. Metrics are weaponized. Cultural debate is compressed into scorekeeping. This simplification distorts the conflict, but it also reveals something true about contemporary consumption. The culture no longer tolerates ambiguity for long. Social media accelerates this process by flattening context. Lyrics are excerpted, isolated from structure, repurposed as slogans. Meaning is extracted and circulated without its supporting framework. Kendrick's dense moral architecture is often reduced to quotes. Drake's emotional immediacy is reduced to caricature. Both artists become symbols stripped of their internal contradictions, repackaged for rapid alignment. This flattening produces a feedback loop. As audiences project meaning onto the rivalry, the artists are forced to respond not just to each other, but to distorted reflections of themselves. The mirror multiplies. Intention loses authority. Perception becomes reality. In this sense, the rivalry illustrates how modern media environments erode authorial control. Once a figure reaches sufficient scale, they no longer direct their narrative. They manage its consequences. The symbolic meaning of the rivalry crystallizes around the question of leadership. Hip-hop has long wrestled with who speaks for the culture and by what criteria. Earlier eras often resolved this through lineage, regional dominance, or lyrical confrontation within bounded spaces. In this era, leadership is contested across metrics and meanings that do not align. Drake leads by presence. Kendrick leads by gravity. The rivalry exposes the impossibility of reconciling these forms under a single crown. This impossibility creates cultural anxiety. The genre appears divided against itself, not because of personal animosity, but because of incompatible answers to the same historical question. What is hip-hop's function in a world where it is no longer marginal? When a form born in resistance becomes infrastructure, what does authenticity even mean? The rivalry does not answer these questions. It forces them into visibility. Psychologically, the conflict operates as collective projection. Kendrick absorbs the role of judge, carrying the shadow the culture is unwilling to face directly. Drake absorbs the role of king, carrying the desires the culture refuses to interrogate. Each becomes a container for opposing forces. The intensity of the reaction to both figures reflects not their actions alone, but the unresolved tension within the audience itself. The rivalry also reshapes artistic production beyond the two figures. Younger artists are compelled to position themselves in relation to the conflict, whether they acknowledge it or not. Some lean toward introspection, signaling seriousness through conceptual density. Others lean toward accessibility, signaling relevance through adaptability. The field polarizes subtly, influencing aesthetic choices, thematic focus, and even release strategies. Critically, the rivalry alters how success is discussed. Numbers are no longer neutral. They are moralized. Depth is no longer assumed to be virtuous. It is questioned for its reach. The discourse becomes saturated with comparison, often at the expense of appreciation. Music is evaluated not only on its own terms, but on how it advances or resists one side of the symbolic divide. As the conflict reverberates, fatigue sets in, not because the issues are resolved, but because the spectacle has consumed itself. The audience begins to recognize the limits of alignment. The binary starts to feel insufficient, yet the residue remains. Perception has shifted. The genre cannot return to a state where dominance and meaning are assumed to coincide. This is the true impact of the rivalry. It destabilizes the center. It reveals that hip-hop no longer has a single axis of authority. The throne is visible, but it is contested by forces that cannot occupy it simultaneously. The rivalry does not destroy the culture. It exposes its fracture lines. What follows is not reconciliation, but legacy. The final movement examines what remains after the noise recedes, and why this conflict continues to matter even in its absence. When the noise subsides, what remains is not closure but recalibration. The rivalry between Drake and Kendrick Lamar does not end in victory, concession, or reconciliation. It settles into the cultural architecture as a reference point, a fault line that continues to shape perception long after the immediate exchanges fade from attention. Its legacy is not contained in specific tracks or moments, but in how it reorganizes meaning. Drake emerges from the conflict still dominant in scale, still occupying the center of visibility. The crown remains on display, reinforced by numbers, reach, and continued relevance. Yet its symbolic weight has changed. Dominance no longer reads as self-justifying. Every new success arrives with an unspoken comparison, an echo of the questions Kendrick forced into the open. Longevity becomes a defense rather than a given. Presence is no longer neutral. It is interpreted. This shift does not diminish Drake's influence. It complicates it. His music continues to circulate as infrastructure, woven into everyday life. But the narrative of effortless supremacy is disrupted. The empire remains intact, yet its walls are now visible. The spotlight that once conferred authority now also exposes vulnerability. To rule continuously is to be continuously assessed. Kendrick emerges with his authority intact, but burdened by expectation. His position as moral counterweight becomes solidified, almost institutionalized. Silence, once strategic, now risks being read as avoidance. Each return is anticipated as judgment, each project expected to carry cultural reckoning. The role he claimed threatens to harden into obligation. Authority gained through resistance is difficult to sustain without repetition. This is the paradox of his legacy. By refusing the logic of constant visibility, Kendrick elevated absence into power. But power attracts demand. The culture waits for him to speak, to clarify, to correct. His restraint is no longer free. It is monitored. The shadow he once wielded as critique now follows him as expectation. Together, their trajectories illustrate the cost of symbolic roles once they crystallize. Drake cannot easily step outside dominance without risking relevance. Kendrick cannot easily step outside critique without risking authority. The rivalry locks both figures into positions that constrain as much as they empower. This is not punishment. It is consequence. Culturally, the aftermath of the rivalry leaves hip-hop without a singular center. The genre continues, prolific and diverse, but the illusion of unified leadership is gone. There is no uncontested voice that can speak for the whole. Instead, authority fragments. Different audiences gravitate toward different poles, constructing their own hierarchies of value. This fragmentation is not failure. It is maturation under pressure. The rivalry becomes a myth not because it resolves conflict, but because it articulates a tension that cannot be resolved. It joins a lineage of cultural stories where opposing forces define the boundaries of an era. The myth persists because it continues to explain experience. Whenever questions of authenticity, success, and responsibility surface, the figures of Drake and Kendrick reappear as reference points. Importantly, the legacy is not static. It evolves as the culture evolves. New artists reinterpret the rivalry's meaning through their own work. Some reject the binary altogether, blending accessibility with depth in ways that challenge the original opposition. Others amplify one side, deepening the divide. The rivalry remains relevant because it does not dictate outcomes. It frames possibilities. The media continues to invoke the conflict because it offers clarity in a crowded field. Narratives crave anchors. Drake and Kendrick provide them. But beneath this repetition, a quieter understanding takes hold. The rivalry was never about personal animosity. It was about structure, about how power circulates, about what is demanded of artists when they become symbols larger than themselves. In this sense, the aftermath is ongoing. The rivalry did not conclude. It stabilized. It became part of the genre's unconscious, resurfacing whenever debates about value intensify. It operates as a reminder that visibility and meaning do not automatically align, that success and authority answer different questions. What remains is clarity without comfort. The culture sees itself more clearly now, fractured, expansive, conflicted. There is no final verdict, no moral resolution. Only an understanding of the forces at play, and the recognition that such conflicts are not anomalies but expressions of historical pressure. The stage remains. The lights remain on. The echo does not fade.